This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and welcome to another show that we're going to be talking about race and reconciliation in this country. And it may seem like kind of an odd topic considering everything that's been going on, but with some of the natural disasters, and I think everybody's a little on edge from everything that has been happening in the past week or so. But I hope to be able to show you how some of the things that we are experiencing really adds to the importance of engaging in a reconciliation process. So as we get prepared for today's show, I do want to remind you that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. As I mentioned, it's been kind of a stressful week for those of us that have been on the coast, whether you've been in the Savannah coastal area and dealing with Hurricane Irma, or whether you've been in southeast Texas and dealing with Hurricane Harvey and the aftermath of that and the cleanup surrounding that and the tension surrounding that. And it really bears to mind as I was going through and looking at and really digesting on everything that's happened the past couple of weeks, it really brings to mind the importance of us looking at how we need to understand other cultures and really taking a closer look at the iceberg culture, the deep culture that I'm going to talk about, and actually the guest that's going to be calling in shortly is going to be talking about also. So as a reminder, if this is the first time you've listened to the show, there is a website, onehumannation.info, and you can go there and take a look at some of the things that I've posted. And one of the concepts is this cultural iceberg that I'm going to be referring to in this show. And the way the cultural iceberg is set up, if you think about an iceberg, everything above the watermark, everything that you see above the watermark is like the surface culture, the external culture. It's the things that you see that are visible, whether it's in reference to food or festivals or holidays or how someone's dressed, arts, crafts, literature, language, music, dances, games, that kind of things. It's the things that you see, the external that we see. Talking about the deep culture, what's below the waterline, what's really driving the iceberg is the subculture. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and kind of continue on this journey into looking at our internal culture, taking a look at what's driving us, because no matter how much we look at outside situations and try to, it's easier to judge someone else or another situation or what should have happened in a particular situation. It's a lot harder to take a look at our internal culture. What are some of our internal biases that's driving how we relate to each other, how we interact with each other? So I'm going to give you an example that happened to me today. It's sad to say that I don't have to go back too far in my memory to come across something that that I can use as a real experience. So this was today. It has been a stressful week, and added to the stress for me is that there's also some renovation work being done at my house, separate from anything that would occur because of the storms or flooding or anything. I didn't have any of that. There was a temporary power outage on the Monday this past week, but that was really kind of taken care of rather quickly. There was something else that triggered after that I would need to kind of engage in these conversations with different municipalities or to get some services taken care of, some situations resolved. But today, as I was working through some of the painters working at the property at the house, I was informed by one of the workers. He said, Sandy, there's somebody that's driven up, two guys in a car, and they're coming towards the house. And I'm like, okay. And my yard is fenced, so you have to you have to get in, so to speak, as opposed to just walking up to the front door. So before I could get out the door, I heard this tone of voice, saw this white male having this tone of voice with one of the workers who happened to be an African American male. And the question, at least from what I can recall, because it really irritated me, the question was, well, what are you doing? And he's saying this to the person that's inside my yard working. And the only thing that was left off of that interrogation question, I felt, was the word boy. Like, what are you doing, boy? And it was this tone of voice that I was like, oh, this is not good. So I'm headed now out the front door, kind of in this revolution mode to figure out who are these people and what are they doing in my yard. And I could tell they were surprised that the person that was coming to the door was an African American female. And at about the same time, the other worker, who happened to be a white male, was coming up behind me. So I could see they were like, okay, so I had to go through this really adjustment of my attitude, because it just really struck me the wrong way. And so by the time I got to the gist of who they were and what they were trying to do, needless to say, they did not have a warm welcome. And it just speaks to why it's so important that we recognize what our unconscious biases are, because it was very apparent to me that they did not realize who was in charge of the situation. They did not realize who had the authority on that property. And once they did realize that it was me, a black female, that had that authority on the property, really it was too late, because they were politely invited off the property. And so it just goes to speak to, we have to be aware. And it wasn't really a teachable moment to me to say to the people that were showing racism, basically, that, you really need to adjust your attitude. I do think on one level they realized that they had made this major mistake, this major assumption that was totally incorrect. But by then they knew, and I'm sure it was just my tone of voice and my facial expression at that point, that it was a little too late for them to make the correction. So I do want to emphasize, as we get ready to welcome the guest caller that's going to be calling in, we're going to be taking a look at, as he talks about some of his stories, how our subculture, our attitudes towards our expectations, and this is on the iceberg culture that's posted at the One Human Nation website. And here's our caller now, and I'm going to take his call, and we're going to go to a short break.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
It's going to be a pro with that technology before long. Are you surrounded by buttons and microphones and speakers and dials? I'm ready to go live. Yes, I can.
Internal culture. So let me just back up, Chris. Welcome to the show, One Human Nation show. And I would like to get started with just some background information about you as far as, where you grew up and what that experience was like. So we can kind of get a framework of where we're gonna be focusing today.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm very excited. Regarding my background, I'm an Air Force brat. So I was born in Fairbanks, Alaska, and we went from Alaska to Alabama to Turkey, to Germany, back to Turkey, all by the time I was 4.
Wow.
And so my first childhood memories are actually from Turkey. And then from Turkey, we moved to San Antonio, Texas, and then to Austin, Texas. My parents at that point split up, and I was probably in the 2nd or 3rd grade when that happened. Eventually, my mother moved my sisters and I have an older sister and a younger sister. She moved us to Minnesota in the middle of high school for a career move. And we moved back to Texas about 2 years later for the weather. So,
yeah, I totally understand that.
So, and I went to school in Vermont. So that's
wow.
That's my basic travel history as at least as a young Thomas.
A young Thomas, I like that. So, what was some of your earliest memories? And we talked about this a little bit off of the air. What was some of your earliest memories as it related to you and race? Some of the earlier conversations or experiences that you remember?
Growing up in the 70s, it was really interesting. Like I said, I was an Air Force brat, and both of my parents were well educated. And they did everything that they could to make sure that my sisters and I were well equipped to deal with some of the pressures that the world throws at you. So I can remember in Turkey, for example, my father talking about some of his colleagues that were going to be posted in Iceland, in Reykjavik, and at the time, Iceland had made very clear, of course, that they wanted U.S. military assistance, and there's a base there. But they did not want any of the black service members to be part of that assistance.
Okay.
And so that was a discussion that we had at a very early age.
So when you say, let me ask you, Chris, when you say a very early age, what age were you when that discussion occurred?
I would have been 4 then.
Wow.
And one of his colleagues was going to be posted in Iceland, and I was friends with their daughter, and so it came about, of course, because one of my closest friends was going to be leaving, and that's just part and parcel with military life. But the U.S. military had also made it very clear at that point that they were going to station whoever was best qualified, regardless of race, which meant that there were black service members that were stationed in Iceland. But but it was something expressly that the government had voiced was not their preference.
Right.
So we had those conversations, like I said, when I was 4 years old, and they were more detailed than that. That was one instance. We lived on the base for a while, and we lived off the base for a while. And when we lived on the base, my mother was she was very protective and very particular about which children I played with. Less so off the base, and so from an overt, perhaps you would say, discrimination perspective, there was far less of that off the base when interacting with Turkish citizens or with Germans than what we experienced on the base with fellow service members. There were some families where my mom just made it very clear that that they did not consider black people their equal, and that they did not want their children playing with us, even if we appeared to have a good friendship.
Okay. So after going through that experience, especially, it's amazing to me, you were 4 years old and having to absorb that and how that was going to shape your identity, because we talk a lot about how our identities are shaped at a very early age. And I think it's incredible that you can remember. I don't think I remember what happened to me at 4 years old. I remember my first experience, but I was going from first grade to second grade. As at least as far as I can recall. So as you continue down this journey, and with your mom being very actively engaged in how things were going to be shaped, share with us when you moved to Texas and how that experience was for you. I think we talked about what happened when you were like in second grade and had an African American teacher. And
That's right.
So
yeah, we go ahead.
That's okay. I was just giving you the opportunity to go on and tell that part of the story.
So my perspective was always very unique because my father was a commander in the military, and so he was in a position of leadership, which meant that we frequently had public functions, that we frequently hosted other families, and so you had this tension between the racial aspect and the fact that my father was in many cases the boss.
Right.
So that particular tension was something that, in terms of remembering early friction, it was probably because they made those conversations very clear, so that my sister, my older sister, and I at the time were equipped to deal with them. And we moved from Turkey to San Antonio, Texas, a couple days before my 5th birthday, and we stayed in TLQs, that's temporary living quarters,
right,
outside Lackland, or on Lackland Air Force Base, for probably a good 4 to 6 weeks before we were actually able to buy a house and stay there. And from there we moved to Austin. So we were only in San Antonio for about a year, and that was because the military was putting my father into a PhD program in computer science at the University of Texas. That's really what brought our family to Austin and to Texas. So education was always a key factor for my family. My mom did a lot of work homeschooling us, and everything from math to to reading and writing and science. She spared no expense and was really extremely diligent about preparing my older sister and I, so that and this is something that maybe not a lot of people know, but military schools at the time, and maybe it's different now, they did not necessarily have a great reputation in terms of the quality of the education that you got.
Okay.
And that might be something that's different now. That might have just been my mother's perspective, but she felt that very strongly, and so she worked extremely hard because she wanted to make sure that when we entered public school that we were not behind grade level for our age, that we were at least on par and preferably ahead of the curve. My first real indicator of things being different for blacks and for black students really occurred to me when I was in the second grade, and I had an African American teacher at the time. My mother, as I said, had done a lot of work with us, especially in subjects like math. And so we were doing long division, when we were in the first grade.
Right.
And I had a brilliant older sister to compete with. She really set the tone. She was the pace setter. So, I never wanted to be considered inferior to her in any form or fashion. So whatever she did, I had the perspective, well, I can do it just as well or better.
Right.
But we were in class one day doing a math exercise, and it was a competition. It was a division competition, and the class was divided into the girls and the boys. And the teacher would give you a problem, and one girl and one boy would both go up to the chalkboard, and you would race to solve the equation. And the winning side was going to get like cookies and juice and 10 minutes longer break or something of that nature. At the time, the girl who was considered to be the smartest kid in our class and in our grade was named Jill. And I recall her very well. She was very pretty. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, and we were friends. But
competition is competition.
Exactly, right. Nobody wanted to compete with Jill because it was assumed that as the smartest person in our grade that she would just annihilate whoever was going against her. And I stepped up and I said, well, I'll go against Jill. And so when it was our turn, the teacher gave us a problem, and we went up to the board. And a lot of these things were just how quickly you could write, right? So
Right.
If you understood how to do the math, it was how quickly you could show all the work. But I was able to do most of the math in my head, and I didn't show very much work, and I won that round. And the teacher gave us the point, and she cautioned me that I needed to show my work. And so the next time around, with the girls and the boys evenly tied, I was up against Jill Jones again, and she gave us an equation, and I solved it very quickly, and she disqualified me. And when I protested, she said, well, you cheated. And I said, no, I didn't. How did I cheat? What did I do? And she said, you just copied Jill's work. I said, well, if I didn't show my work and if I didn't show Jill's work, how did I copy Jill's work? And she said, well, you looked at what she was doing and figured out where she was going, and you used that to get the answer. And I swore to her that I did not cheat, and eventually we got our point. And what I told her was, we've been doing this kind of division in my family for 2 years. All the problems you gave me are easy. These are even multiples. You didn't give us, even for a long division, you gave us numbers that go into each other evenly. So I know how to do this. And she didn't believe me, but she decided to test me, and she gave me a harder problem, and I was able to solve that one without showing any work. And finally, she gave me a problem that was difficult enough that I actually had to show my work. And she still held me after class because she still believed that I was cheating, even though I had proven that I could do much more difficult work. And what I took from that situation was that I was so disappointed that she didn't see how smart I was.
Right.
And I had a little bit of an intellectual ego chip on my shoulder then. that I really was disappointed that she didn't recognize it, and that she had such a low expectation of me as a student, that
Right.
there was no way that she could believe that I understood how to do that. And even when I'd explained to her, we've been doing this in my family for years. My mom started showing us how to divide, at the same time she showed us how to multiply.
Right.
And that was, this is what we do in my family. That's
the
why
fun.
I can do it so easily.
Wow.
And so from that point on, I really took note of what the expectations were for Black students and for white students, and how our success was received. I typically found that when I did things well, there was relatively little fanfare, but when Jill or some other student did things well, that was not Black, that it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. That they were kind of expected to succeed, and their successes were celebrated. And I always felt as though my successes were minimized, which really just made me much more competitive.
Yeah. So let me ask you, did your parents talk to you about this? We call it the talk, when your parents have the talk about, that you have to do things better and, work harder and, trying to adjust your expectations so that you're not feeling that disappointment when you don't get the accolades or the recognition. And we talked about this a little off the air, but did your parents have that talk with you?
That was the kind of talk that we probably had a couple times a week at dinner, because there were always situations. My father would relate some of his experiences, so that we had corollaries, and my older sister, who truly was the smartest girl in the grade, 3 years ahead of me, she would relate her experiences, and so most of our discussions there centered around not placing your self-worth in the praise that you would get from teachers or even peers, that we had to set our own marks, that we had to set our own standards for success, and that we had to understand that not everybody was for us, that we would find some champions and that we would find some allies, and that there were some good people that would think that we were wonderful, but that there were some other folks that might feel quite the opposite, and that we almost had to treat those two scenarios in the same way. That the folks that thought that we were wonderful, that we had to take that with a huge grain of salt, and the folks that did not appear to have any investment in our success, that we had to take them with just as big of a grain of salt, and that we had to establish our own measures for what made us successful and what gave us our value.
Wow. Yeah, so I can't believe how quickly time is moving along, Chris. So if you can hold onto the line, don't hang up. I'm going to make a couple of announcements and come back and chat with you some more, because I want to talk about how this translated or how it related to you going into teaching, and what those experiences were like for you teaching, especially since there was such a huge impact from the teachers that you had, and you mentioned the African American teacher, but that was just one example, because I'm sure it was an ongoing thing whether you had a white teacher or an African American teacher. And that's one of the things we talk about on the show, is what are those expectations. So if you can hold on and don't go anywhere, don't hang up, and I'll be right back with you, okay?
Perfect.
Okay. The 36th Annual Savannah Jazz Festival on September 17th through 23rd is the greatest week-long music event in the region. The Savannah Jazz Festival features world-class blues, gospel, and jazz, and this year's special guests include bluesman Victor Wainwright, singer Carmen Bradford, and the legendary Wycliffe Gordon. Added to this are local legends and great military and college bands. Check out the full schedule at www.savannahjazzfest.com. Again, that website is www.savannahjazzfest.com. You're listening to WRUU-LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. And we're going to go back with our guest, Chris, and talk more about some of the adult experiences with teaching. So, Chris, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. So I don't want to miss anything, but I also am very conscious of the time. So I'm sure there were experiences, going through grade school and junior high as well as high school. But I did want to talk a little bit about your college experience and what kind of fields you went into as part of your, I hate to say career choice, but I can't think of anything else right now how to describe it. So if you can talk a little bit about that as far as your experience in being on the teaching side in the public school system.
Absolutely, yes. I was thrilled to be a teacher. I left a corporate job at the time. I was either a director or a VP of sales and marketing for an importer exporter, as they'd say. And I went into teaching largely because I saw a lot of students like myself that didn't necessarily have all the same advantages that I had. Mm-hmm. I realized by the time I was an adult what an advantage it was having a mother who invested so much time and so much care and so much skill. Because time and care are one thing, but really skill into my education and into character development. And I realized that there were so many times that I certainly made many mistakes along the way, but the mistakes would have been greatly compounded without my mother's teachings. Okay. And I would have made many, many, many more mistakes without them. One of the things that occurred to me as a student was that sometimes I did as well or as poorly as the type of teacher that I had. Teachers that pushed me, I did extremely well. Teachers that didn't push me, I frequently did the bare minimum. Right. And I gradually began to see that there were some teachers who consistently pushed every student, regardless of who they were, regardless of their family, their economics, or their race. And there were some teachers that I noticed growing up really did not seem to take the same interest in educating the black students as well as they did the white students. That's a very black and white statement, but it was something that I just saw borne out growing up in Texas from school to school. And I'll point out that typically my family was on the upper middle class side of town, so I would be one of the only black students in class frequently. When I was teaching, some of the most salient experiences were teaching in East Texas. I taught in a town called Nacogdoches, which is a town of about, I want to say 20,000 or so, maybe 25,000. And it's in a picturesque little alcove of East Texas, piney woods, some hills. And they underwent a really just
cultural
an
shift.
incredible yes, exactly. Like the dynamic of the entire town changed after Hurricane Katrina. There was an influx of black students and of black families. So the school went from being 85 to 87% white, and the rest black and Hispanic and other, as those categories go, to almost overnight being 65% black and Hispanic, and it wasn't something that many of the teachers or the residents were necessarily prepared for culturally.
Right.
And so the high school in particular had a fair number of teachers that had been teaching there for decades, and that were very, very set in their ways, and for lack of better terminology, they really struggled engaging the African American students. And if you want to look at it from a less benign perspective, some of them simply did not want to engage those students. So the school board settled on what I still think is actually an extremely progressive solution for a small isolated town in East Texas, which was they hired teachers of color from Austin and Dallas and Houston to better sync up with their student population. So I was one of the teachers that was hired. In fact, I was the teacher that introduced the program to the students at a large rally. But at the time, I had I'll have to say, just so that you guys have the image, I had dreads that were halfway down to my butt.
Okay.
So, I'm very clean shaven and clean cut right now, but at the time I had pretty strong dreads. And I taught algebra and geometry, algebra 1 and 2, geometry 1 and geometry 2. What I encountered in Nacogdoches was very, very interesting, and it really explained a lot to me about the beliefs that we have when we grow up, from things like global climate change, whether or not that's something that people believe in, to your basic value in a classroom, a class setting. And so the beauty for me of teaching in Nacogdoches was that I could feel the hunger of the students. I could feel their passion. Now, make no mistake, this is still school. This is still high school, and
Right.
most of my students did not necessarily love sitting through my algebra and geometry classes.
Right.
So I'm not saying I converted the masses
Right.
into loving math, but what they did get was how much I valued their presence there, how important their education was, and how important they were. You want to be able to help people see outside of the confines that they're within. And Nacogdoches was a very small town, and I can remember early on observing a teacher, and she really didn't take the black students to task. Mm-hmm. The way that I was trained as a teacher was that if somebody answered a question that you gave them, that was great, but you didn't just go over and pat them on the back and say, job well done, and move on. You asked them the next step of the question, and then the step after that. You wanted to push them to their point of ignorance so that you knew at what point your teaching began.
Oh, okay.
And if you didn't do that, you hadn't done your job.
Okay.
So if all you did was ask them a question and they answered it, then they simply knew what the answer was. You didn't actually require them to think. You did not demand anything of them, and you didn't get enough information to know what you needed to be teaching them so that you could actually help make them a better student.
Right.
That was the school of thought that was hammered into me, and still is, in any regard. And so when I questioned this teacher about why her standards were so low for the black students, she said, if they don't care, that's fine. We need people to work at Kentucky Fried Chicken and Pizza Hut and Taco Bell.
Oh boy!
And I realized, yeah, that's absolutely right. This world does need those people, right? But when the system essentially dictates who those people are going to be,
right,
through education, we have a real problem. And it was a huge motivator for me. So I started study groups that were very well attended, partially because they had pizza, but partially because many of the students started to lose their fear of math. They started to engage more. One of the things that was always helpful for me was to take math out of the abstract and to root it into something concrete. And so one of the best teachers that I ever had was a calculus professor, and what she was great at was breaking down an equation, and instead of just looking at variables and numbers and letters and so forth, she would say to you, okay, let's say that there is an outbreak of a virus in this region of Brazil. This is the kind of equation that's going to predict how quickly that virus is going to spread to different areas. This variable right here corresponds to the rate of expansion. This variable right here corresponds to, she would just break it down, where she would say, let's say that you're in the military and you have a mortar, and you need to fire that mortar shell from this cliff down to this area right here. But the wind is blowing, and the wind is blowing at 30 miles per hour up top of the cliff, but down at the ground, it's only blowing at 5 miles per hour.
Wow.
This is the type of equation that the software that they use actually uses to determine what the angle of the barrel should be, how far up the shell should go, how the wind is going to affect it, how the wind is changing even as we're doing all of this. And that made all of the math that she taught so much easier.
That is
Rooting
so
it in something
awesome.
concrete. Yeah, I mean, it for me it was a huge eye opener. I loved it, and so those were the type of things that I tried to bring to my teaching. And it took typically having students stay after school or come to my working lunches to be able to implement some of the exercises that I wanted to implement, because the curriculum in Texas schools that are underperforming is dedicated almost solely to test taking, to passing state level tests that get you funding.
Right.
And so when the curriculum becomes so constricting, education really, really suffers.
Right.
Does that sort of answer
that does answer my question? And gosh, I wish I've either had your calculus teacher or because I'm going to tell you, math was not my thing. Math, algebra, I don't even think I made it through calculus. That was not even on the radar. So my mind is spinning to think what that, how she could break it down to make it real. And that is just incredibly, that's just incredible. And I do want to touch base because one of the things I've discovered moving back to Savannah, it's kind of what are the sticking points for the community? What are the hot topics that I hear about that are problem areas? And one is the public school system and how it's not performing the way it should, and how things can be need to be adjusted. But it does speak to the students are only being trained on how to take the test and pass the test, because it's all tied to funding, and it's going to take a shift in thinking to make that happen. I do want to touch base because, believe it or not, Chris, we are kind of running out of time, but we do have about 5 more minutes. So I do 5 or 6 more minutes. So I do want to talk about, and we briefly talked about this off the air when we were chatting, that you are also an author and that you write books. So, and I don't want to assume. So can you give me some ideas or talk to us about what your books are about and your motivation for writing these books?
Yes, I would love to. Ironically, I did not go to school to major in math or to be a math teacher. I went to school, went to a little school called Middlebury College in Vermont, a school of about 2,000 students in a town of about 15,000. And they're best known for their English and creative writing programs and for their language programs. The reason that I ended up teaching math was really so that when my students said to me, "Yo, mister, you've always been good at math. We're not like that." I'd be like, "Au contraire."
Right.
Okay, I really used to stink at math, and I'm here to prove to you that even if you're not good at it, there's a process you can follow that will help you to get good at it. I went into, I had kind of a long career in sales and marketing. That's always been my bread and butter. But about 5 years ago, I realized that even though I'd worked for some really, really good companies and on some great projects, I got to travel internationally with some of the companies I worked with, and I traveled domestically quite a bit, but I was always unhappy. And I realized this when I was on a business trip, and I didn't get the result that I wanted, and I realized I didn't care. As terrible as that sounds,
no, I think that gets to be the case for a lot of us. You just hit the wall. You hit the wall.
Yes, I was most concerned about getting back to my bed, and seeing my girlfriend, and doing some journaling, right?
Right.
And even then, it did not quite hit me. It took a little bit longer for me to realize that even when I changed companies, regardless of the quality of the company, that I just wasn't happy.
Right.
I realized it when I was reading something that one of my old college friends had written, and I noticed then that all of my peers were published. Some of whom I thought were brilliant back in the day in college, and some of whom I felt very much like, well, if they can do it, I can do it. I'm not sure how they got published, but if they can do it, I can do
right.
it. So that was just kind of like a real revelation for me. That was, you've never done what you were meant to do. You've never done what makes you happiest, which is right. And so, coming full circle to your question, I've published a few short stories and some poems, but right now what I'm working on are two different things. One is a book which really explores the tension, the racial tension, especially that we're seeing right now. The title is White People and the Melanated Ones, Fist Fight in Purgatory. And it has very much to do with the tension that we're seeing racially right now. Whereas so many people had seemed to write off racism, conservatives wrote racism off as a dead issue, and many liberals patted themselves on the back for a job well done. Most of the black people that I know have been telling people for as long as they'll listen that no, it's not dead. It's
Yes.
maybe underground. It's mutated.
Right.
It's evolved. It's not always so overt. And what we're seeing, of course, right now is that, yes, it's very much alive. This is like racism, I'd say 2.0, but it's more like 5.0.
Right.
And we're at a point where many people feel far more comfortable actually expressing these views and arguing, in fact, that they're not racist. And so this book explores those tensions, and I've been negotiating with a couple of publishers, and so hopefully within the next 9 to 10 months, I'll be able to put that out. And then the other book is a collection of short stories from my time on the Appalachian Trail with the CEO of Whole Foods, John Mackey.
Okay. That should be interesting. And not to put any more on your plate, but I think it would be awesome if you were inclined to write books geared especially towards young black males. You know, a kind of superhero approach. Because one of the things that I've discovered, you know, in my journey of really looking at history, especially the history where I grew up, is there's so much emphasis when I look at history on how we were, you know, as African Americans beaten down and downtrodden and all the bad things of slavery. And there's you have to really search for those positive, uplifting and motivating. And I think for a lot of our youth, they don't have that connection to either, parents or grandparents or great-grandparents to really know our journey and our story. And I'm just like in this mode now of getting these stories out, especially stories directed towards youth in a way that they can relate to it. So it's not always the negative. It's how taking that tension and making something positive. And it's something that you seem to have done very well. Of course, you had your mom's influence. And one of the stories that I liked was, at what age, how long did it take you before you actually won a game of Scrabble against your mom? Because she sounded relentless. She sounds like my kind of lady. She did not cut you any slack.
Relentless. You nailed it. We started playing Scrabble when I was in the first grade, and I did not beat her until I was 22.
Wow. Are you sure she just didn't let you win? maybe she saw something and she was like, I am just gonna let him win because he's hung in there and he still wants to beat me and that kind of deal. But I think that's awesome. I do want to ask you, Chris, because we're kind of doing the wind up here. What's a way for someone to connect with you? I mean, do you have a blog, or you say you're negotiating on this book? What's a way that listeners can keep up with what you're doing if they're interested in purchasing your book? And of course, you can let me know when that does happen because I'll be more than happy to post it also. But I just wondered if you had a blog because I love your writing. I love the things you post on Facebook, which are hilarious to me, but it needs to be to me a wider audience.
Yes.
Do you have a way for people to connect with you yet, or are you just at the beginning stages of getting, you're in sales and marketing, so you know how important that is. So I'm just gonna put that out there. What's going on? How do we connect with you? How do we stay in touch?
I've actually just started a blog with a couple of other good minds called Goat Lab, and we call it Goat Lab because back in the day you were either the hero or the goat. The goat, obviously was not what you wanted to be.
Right.
But of course, Michael Jordan really turned that on its head, and he co-opted the word goat to mean greatest of all time. So the Goat Lab is the greatest of all time life after Black writers, exploring issues of race and of gender, social injustice, domestic abuse, and so forth. And so that would be the easiest way. I'll send you a link for that.
Okay.
And then, of course, I am on Facebook, but I am still in the early stages of making a lot of this information public.
Okay.
I've been surprised and actually very pleasantly surprised by the response and the need for some of the topics that I'm delving into.
Yes, I think people are hungry for the information, Chris, and I am so sorry that I'm going to need to kind of wrap up this conversation because we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I can see the next host for the show is lurking and looking at me and giving me the eye like, okay, and so I am going to keep the door open for you to come back on the One Human Nation show, if you would, so we'll just continue on this journey together, if you don't mind. But thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all the best, and we'll just continue moving through what I look at as a process of going through reconciliation and healing so that we can get to justice to be one human nation in this country. So thank you so much for joining us, and, continue moving forward.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Really enjoyed it. Have a wonderful day.
Okay, thank you. Coming up next, we're going to be listening to, I would say that it would be Troy, but there is a guest host that's coming in for him for the Sound Limit Show. Thank you so much for listening to the One Human Nation show, and I look forward to next week.